So today I will be talking about my book that was published in January 2023, so fairly recently. And the title of the book is The King's Road, Diplomacy and the Remaking of the Silk Road. So from the title, you can see that this is a book about the Silk Road. This is a concept that we are all more or less familiar with, and this book is my effort to kind of revisit this issue and see what new things that we can say about this topic. So the Silk Road, and here is a kind of a map of the world that is often talked about when we use this term, is a concept that was first invented or coined in the late 19th century by the German geologist and geographer Ferdinand von Isthofen. And the year that this term was coined was officially the publication of a volume by him in 1877, although some recent scholarship kind of demonstrated that in German academia, people have been using this term before him. So he was not the first person to ever use this term, the Seidenstraße, but he was still the first person to sort of theorize it and in a more comprehensive way. And to him, this term essentially means the route that connected China with the Mediterranean world in the time of the Roman Empire. And it is through this route that Chinese silk entered Roman market, and this route this signifies a kind of connection between the East and the West. So that was, late 19th century. Obviously, a lot of things happened between then and now, and the Silk Road has now essentially become a very popular term that scholars use to describe any number of things. There are so here are two fairly recent-ish examples of global history that use the Silk Road in their title. So in these works, the Silk Road can be a more descriptive sort of name for Central Eurasia, or it could also be essentially a way of saying that the history of the world had always been connected. So we use the Silk Road in the case of Peter Frankopan to signify global history. But not everyone agrees with this use of the term. And here I will cite one example, a British archaeologist, Warwick Ball, in his book, Rome in the East, The Transformation of an Empire. He said that there is not a single ancient historical record, neither Chinese nor classical, that even hints at the existence of such a road. So from this perspective, there isn't even such a thing as the Silk Road, and whenever we talk about it, it's not historical. We're doing something else, but we're not doing real historical research. So these are just a few examples, and there are many works, many debates about the Silk Road. Essentially, we still don't agree on whether we can use this term to describe historical phenomena. And if we do decide to do that, what do we mean by this term also differs drastically from one scholar to another. So this is sort of the context in which I'm writing this book. And you guys are looking at the book. There is a lot in this book as there is in any book, so I can't talk about everything that I cover in this book. So what I will talk about today are what I call one very small place that hopefully help us answer or address two very big questions. The small place is the Dunhuang Library Cave, and I'll introduce this and explain to you what this is. But it essentially is a place where many documents are discovered, many medieval documents are discovered. And part of the effort of the book is to use these documents to address two big questions that are still settled, unresolved, rather. The first question is, was there a Silk Road? Is this term a historically meaningful term? And the second question is, assuming that there was a Silk Road, what exactly was this Silk Road? Is it what we think it was? So to start, I'll begin the talk with an introduction to the Dunhuang Library and the kind of social history of long distance travel that I write on the basis of the documents from the Dunhuang Library. So Dunhuang is a oasis town that's located in northwestern China, and so here is a map. You can see this is essentially a map covering central and western China, and Mongolia, and Central Asia. And Dunhuang sits at the heart of this part of the world, the eastern part of the Eurasian continent. Around Dunhuang, there are a number of other important places. The west, I've marked, and these are some places that you will see in this book and in my talk. Places like Turfan, Khotan, Kashgar, all of these were also Central Asian oases states, oases cities. To the east, you have Ganzhou, which is another oasis state, and then further east, you have a big metropolis such as Chang'an, which was the capital of the Tang Dynasty in China, and then Kaifeng, the capital of the Northern Song Dynasty in China. So this is sort of the world that we're looking at. But the center is in Dunhuang because of the Dunhuang caves. And here is a look at the rock face of the Mogao caves in Dunhuang. And you can see that there are all these holes, right? These caves that were dug into the face of the rock, and there are hundreds of them. But the place that I'm talking about today is only one among these hundreds of caves, and one of the smallest ones, which is now called cave number 17. It is a very small cave, but it, you can say that it is the most important archive for the history of the Silk Road, or for the history of pre-modern Central Asia, because of a discovery made by this Taoist monk Wang Yuanlu in 1900. He was cleaning the cave, so that cave wasn't visible. So this small cave was not visible, and he was cleaning the bigger sort of complex and accidentally knocked down the wall and revealed a cave filled with manuscripts like these. And these manuscripts, and here, some of them have already been taken out, but there were altogether about 60,000 manuscripts discovered in this small chamber. So they're important because we know that this cave was sealed in the first or maybe second century of the 11th, first or second decade of the 11th century. So, 1010, 1020, which means that everything that's sealed in the cave are essentially documents that date to before the year 1000. And given the scarcity of primary sources for that period, this cave obviously becomes a very important source of information for the history of medieval China and Eurasia. So what are in these caves? So here I'll give you a very brief kind of introduction of the sources of the manuscript that were discovered in this cave. People disagree with the percentage of documents, but my own assessment is there are 80, 85%, maybe 90% of the documents, the manuscript that are discovered in the caves were written in Chinese. But most of them are Buddhist, right? About 90% of all the content of the cave were Buddhist texts, and most of them were in Chinese. But a substantial number, maybe 10, even over 10% of the entirety of the collection are manuscripts written in Tibetan. And then you have represented, you have a much smaller group of documents written in other languages, such as this one in Khotanese, which is the Middle Iranian language used by the kingdom of Khotan to the west of Dunhuang. And then Sogdian, that is also a Middle Iranian language, Eastern Middle Iranian language used by people in Sogdiana, which is roughly present-day Uzbekistan. You also have Uyghur documents, you have Sanskrit texts, and then you have this very unique representative, unique example of Hebrew document from this collection. So this is sort of roughly what we have from the Dunhuang cave. There's 60,000 of them, about 10% are secular documents. So you can see that we're dealing with a very large collection of documents. So this book is essentially my effort to look through these secular documents and write a history of how people traveled through Dunhuang and around Dunhuang. So to give you a sense of the kind of information that we can get from these documents, here I will, well, first of all, before I get to that, the one point that I should make is that the documents all date to, or the overwhelming majority of the secular documents date to between roughly the year 850 to 1000, right? So if you have a collection of documents that all date to 1000, but because they're accumulated, so the majority of the texts were closer to the time of the closure of the cave so there are fewer earlier texts and more later texts is what I'm trying to say. So which means that the majority of the texts that we have are from the 9th and the 10th century. And that period in the history of China and Eastern Eurasia is an era of political fragmentation. When you talk about Chinese history, starting the early 10th century, you enter a period called the period of 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Right? You don't need to know the names of these places to know that this is a time of political fragmentation. It's after the Tang Dynasty. And in Central Asia, in Tibet, you have similar situation. The Uyghur Empire collapsed in the middle of the 9th century. The Tibetan Empire collapsed in the middle of the 9th century. So the documents that we have now are representatives of a political moment when there weren't any big empires anymore. So we have a lot of small kingdoms, but you really didn't have large empires as we used to in the 7th and the 8th century. And Dunhuang itself was part of this world. Dunhuang, for this period, was an independent oasis kingdom. It was not part of the Tang when the Tang is still there, it was definitely not part of any other state after the Tang fell. So this is sort of the date and the contour of the collection. And using that, we can actually begin to understand how people travel in medieval Eurasia. And here, I'll try to select a few representative examples to kind of reconstruct a long distance journey through the heartland of Eurasia in 9th and 10th century. So before just like nowadays, before you go somewhere, you look at the weather report and see if it's a good day to make the trip. For medieval people in Eurasia, one of the things that they look at are these prophecy books, these prognostication book that allows them to assess or to determine if this is an auspicious time to travel. And people consult these books before their journey began. And so these books tell us a bit about the considerations, about the worries that these travelers have. For instance, there's one would say that if you travel on this day, there will be wine and meat if you go east, and it will be auspicious if you go south. But if you go west or north, your trip will be delayed. So you can use these documents to kind of help you navigate your journeys. But in order to prepare for your trip, you also have to have the means of transportation. So here is a contract through which or by using which a traveler borrowed a borrowed one yellow male camel for his journey from Dunhuang to the Chinese capital. You also would need communal support from your local area, right? And here is a document that's called the rule for the Society of Long Distance Travel that explains to you the kind of support you can get from the local community once you begin your journey. We'll get back to this document in a little bit. But once you start your journey, you kind of have to know where you're going. There's no GPS, there's no barely any maps that we know of. So the kind of road guide that we find in Dunhuang are things like this: the lists of places that tells you how long does it take to get from point A to point B. And this is one of these documents, a path to India. This is a guide for someone who travels from China to India. And if you put them on the map, and here's the first leg of the trip, it tells you that if you leave Haifeng, which was the Song Dynasty capital, and if you travel 4,000 li, you get to a place called Lingzhou, and then you travel 20 days and you get to this place called Ganzhou, and so on and so forth. So this type of documents help you, broadly speaking, make sure that you're on the right track. You can, once you get to the place, you can ask people, am I in Lingzhou or not? If I'm not, then maybe I'm wrong, I'm in the wrong direction. So it serves some purpose to help the travelers. There are also other types of road guides. So this type is sort of point A to point B to point C, whereas this is point A. Once you get to point A, how do you get to point B? There are more detailed guides like this, right? So here, I'm quoting from this geography. It says the road leads to Dunhuang by way of the old Yang Pass. The road edges many precipitous places. There are 8 springs, all possessing grassland. The road is treacherous and cannot be passed at night. In the 2 seasons of spring and fall, the snow is deep and the road is not passable. So here you have a more detailed explanation of what to do. So beyond the big picture, now you can read these type of texts and determine what is a good time of the year to travel and where to stop on the road, whether you need to bring water with you or not, because of the existence or absence of water sources. But these are only the natural things that you need to navigate. And we all know that when you travel, nature is not the only thing that you need to navigate. You need to also navigate social relations. You need to know kind of people that you encounter on the road. And then here is a Tibetan introduction letter that helped that is from one Tibetan monk to another Tibetan monk, introducing to the second monk a Chinese monk traveling from China to India to see, quote, the relics of Shakyamuni. And through letters like this, our travelers could establish social connections. So in addition to knowing where they're going, now they can actually know the people that they encounter. And once they do that, the people who they met on the road often would reciprocate, would establish relationships with the travelers as well. And here is an example of the kind of food that the government of Dunhuang provided. Well, in this case, it's wine, the kind of wine that the government of Dunhuang provided for long-distance travelers from other places. In this case, all of them were diplomatic travelers from Khotan, from Ganzhou. So from this, you can see that once the travelers came to a certain place, it also sort of mobilizes or activates the local government, local hosts. They had to respond to the travelers, they had to provide for them. And we have many examples, such as this kind of provision of list of provisions provided for travelers. And here's another example, a distribution of paper for travelers, because paper is something that you always have to use when you're traveling. So the local government also provides paper for travelers who came to their domain. On the other hand, these travelers also give their hosts gifts. And here is a beautifully preserved receipt of a gift, which is one chunk of white jade that was given to the king of Dunhuang by a diplomatic traveler from Khotan. So you can see the reciprocal relationship between the travelers and their hosts. Another problem that travelers would encounter, as we would now when we travel to foreign places, that sometimes we don't speak the language. So what do you do when that happens? We also see traces of people dealing with that in Dunhuang documents in the form of bilingual phrase books, such as this one. So when you look at this document, you can see that it's written in Brahmi script. But the highlighted part here is actually Chinese. It's Chinese language written in Brahmi script, Shun Tang La, which is from the Chinese phrase Shui Dan Lai, which means bring water. And then the next phrase is written in Khotanese, Ujaba Bara, which means the same thing, bring the water. So as you can see, as long as you can read the Brahmi script, now you can sort of be able to transition between these two languages. If you know Khotanese, you can look it up and learn how to say this phrase in Chinese and vice versa. And by using these documents, the travelers who are not multilingual could manage to communicate with people. And we use this still. If you go to the bookstore, you still find phrase books in other languages, right? So this is exactly the same kind of thing. Other phrases, bring the salt, make food quickly. And then we also have other Sanskrit Khodanese bilingual phrase books, Chinese, and then Tibetan Khodanese and Turkic, many different types of bilingual phrase books. And some of them deal explicitly with the theme of travel. So here, the Sanskrit Khodanese one says, "Where are you going?" And the answer is, "I am going to China." So these are things that you can actually use in your conversation when you're traveling. Many of them also sent private letters, and the letters were often written not by the travelers, but by people who were not traveling but who wanted to use the travelers to deliver their letters. So the travelers in these cases often also served as postal service. And here is one example of a monk from Turfan who wrote to monks in Dunhuang. And the content of the letter is very vague, and there isn't very much involved. It just is an expression of a good feeling. Hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. But what's interesting here is that attached to the letter, the monk sent 3 pieces or 3 watermelons to Dunhuang. So we all know that Turfan is famous for the kind of fruits that even now, and you can see that in this period, it was already producing pretty interesting fruits that were used as gifts. But in addition to these letters, the travelers themselves also wrote reports. And if you were on a official journey, you have to describe what you see and what you did in your report back to your king. And here's one of the pretty rich collection of official envoy reports written in Khotanese that talk about how the road to Suzhou was blocked by the Tatars, and as a result, only birds in the air could fly. No one can walk. Right? So this is reporting on the condition of the road, but this is only one dimension of many, many rich information included in these official reports. And then, of course, like the places that you go to in China, you would see tourist graffiti on the walls of the Dunhuang caves. And here's one example that were left by a group of people who visited sacred relics in the year 900. So this is interesting because it kind of reveals another dimension of these journeys. These people weren't always only traveling for utilitarian purposes. They were also interested in seeing sights, as we do. And many of them were traveling for religious reasons as well. So, you've got to where you want to be, or you arrived at the stop that on the way to your final destination, and now you need to leave and start the next leg of the journey. As we do with our hosts nowadays, very often the last thing you need to do before you depart on the next leg of the journey is that you need to leave a note to your host. And here is a thank you note that was left by someone who visited Dunhuang, that expresses the gratitude for the accommodation and the provision by the government. And then you can assume that this process repeats itself once you start the next journey. So these examples hopefully show that there is a rich collection of documentation in the Dunhuang archive that really reveals in a way that you don't see anywhere else on the Eurasian continent how people travel, how people conducted long distance travel. You really don't have this kind of density of documentation anywhere else in pre-modern tradition. So this is really a very rich collection of documents. And I would argue, and I argue in the book, that these examples help us answer some basic questions about the Silk Road. And the first question is, of course, when you talk about the Silk Road, the first thing you have to ask yourself is this really a thing? Was there really a Silk Road? Or is the network of travelers that you observed in these documents something else that you shouldn't call them the Silk Road? So this is actually an idea that I've already quoted Paul, and here I quote another scholar I really admire, Justin Jacobs, who said that the Silk Road is a purely modern intellectual construct, one that would have been pretty unfamiliar and likely incomprehensible to those historical agents that it purports to describe. So this is a fairly strong statement, saying that we use the term Silk Road to describe pre-modern people, but they have no idea about this term. So we should be cautious about using this. But what I discovered reading these Dunhuang documents is that Jacobs is correct in the sense that they didn't use the term the Silk Road. This is not a term that existed in any language in the Dunhuang archive. But I think if we ask them about this, and this is because they're not historians, they're not trying to synthesize their own experience, right? But if we ask them about this term, I would argue that it would not have been incomprehensible to them either. And there are a lot of examples that I cite in the book, but here I'll give you one example. And this is a song, and this is sort of the material that I used in the introduction to the book. A song that's performed or sang on the New Year's Day in Dunhuang, that describes the kind of ideal world. New Year's wish, if you will, right? We want, hopefully next year it will be like this. So what is it? What is it that the residents of Dunhuang wanted for the new year? So they wanted the 10,000 commoners, all the residents in Dunhuang, they can sing songs with their belly completely filled, so they can have enough to eat. And the time of their life resembled those of Shun and Yao, these sage kings of the Chinese antiquity. And then the singer says, please do not worry about the eastern road being blocked. In the spring, the heavenly envoys will arrive, and they will offer large jin silk, large pieces of jin silk with coiled dragon, and different kinds of textiles and silk to us. And then a few, and this is sort of talking about the eastern neighbor to Dunhuang, right? A few lines later, it continues to talk about the western neighbor of Dunhuang. To the west, all the way into Khotan, the road will be smoother than covered with cotton, and the Khotanese envoys will offer treasured artifacts and white jade and 1,000 pieces of cotton, silk, and miscellaneous cloth. And all within the border of Dunhuang will chant the song of happiness and enjoy the long life of Hengzu, who presumably lived for 800 years. So if we read this song, which was performed and popular in Dunhuang at the time, closely, if we read it closely, there are two elements that are pretty prominent. So they sang about different kinds of textiles, right? So these textiles, including silk, clearly were important to the well-being of people in Dunhuang. But not only that, they connect these textiles to the road to the east and to the west. So they argue that the road that channeled these textiles and other kind of precious goods into Dunhuang, these things are a crucial part of our well-being, of our wish for a good new year. So I would argue that when we read things like this, it sort of compels us to say that the Silk Road, even though as a term was not present in these pre-modern sources, it would not have been a utterly unfamiliar idea if we're able to ask people in Dunhuang. So if, maybe we can say that this is a term that we should continue to use to describe the world of pre-modern travelers, then the next question, this is the second big question that I want to ask, is what exactly was it that, if there is such a thing, or there was such a thing, and what was exactly the Silk Road that you can find in the Dunhuang documents? There are a number of different dimensions to this question. So I'll talk about three. The first is, what is the nature of this network of long distance connection? We tend to normally, when we talk about the Silk Road, the first association that we have of it is that it is a commercial network. It's merchants traveling on the Silk Road with silk and other materials. But as Valerie Hansen has pointed out, the materials, the documents and physical materials that were discovered in the library cave rarely mention merchants. So all the examples that I've shown you, and my own examination of the documents confirm what Valerie Hansen said in her book, that I have found in all these secular documents, maybe one or two examples of long distance traveling merchants. So there are people traveling long distances, but they were not merchants. So what are they? Who were they? And so here I will give you one example of a group of diplomatic travelers from Dunhuang to Chang'an. So here is a very rough map of the route that they could have taken. That happened in the year 878, so in the late Tang Dynasty. We know a lot about this group because there's a beautiful document that reported on their activities once they arrived in Chang'an that is preserved in Dunhuang. So from this document, we know that this group of 29 diplomatic travelers went to the Chinese border, and then 13 of them were allowed to go to Chang'an. The other 16 were stopped at the border, and they brought to the to the Tang Emperor one piece of jade, one antelope horn, and then one yak tail of a yak. And that's all. That's all the gifts that they brought. They traveled for 2,000 miles from Dunhuang to Chang'an to bring these things to the Tang Emperor. And if we keep reading, in return, the Tang Emperor gave them all sorts of stuff: clothing, silk, silverware, to each and every one of these travelers, in addition to gifts to the king of Dunhuang. And these are silverwares. And then, importantly, they also paid for the travel, the round trip fare. This phrase called 托马价, the price for the horse and the camels. Essentially, it means the cost that these travelers, the sort of investment that the travelers made for this journey is covered by the emperor in his return gift. So if we calculate this, right, the gift from the Dunhuang people were these one piece of jade, one antelope horn, and one yak tail. The counter gift, calculate the numbers, altogether amounts to about 1,800 P of silver, and 42 sets of clothing, and 19 pieces of silverware. 1 P is about 12 meters. So you can do the math. I can do the math very quickly, but it's a significant amount. So what this tells us is that this particular group of travelers, and there are 29 of them, were not traveling, they were making gains, they were making significant material gains, but they were not traveling for commercial purposes. They were not traveling as merchants. Instead, they were traveling as diplomats from the independent kingdom of Dunhuang, and they were treated as diplomats when they arrived in Chang'an. Here is another example of a report written by diplomatic travelers, also in the late. So this is interesting because the report mentions the death of Huang Chao, who was the person who almost overthrew the Tang dynasty. But for me, the report is interesting because it mentions, in the process of reporting about the death of Huang Chao, it mentions 4 Dunhuang diplomatic missions that were at different stages of returning at the same time, which means that in the year, at this very moment, in 884, there were 4 different diplomatic missions that Dunhuang's government sent to Chang'an that were on the road traveling. So it kind of, and so these 2 are, and I'll get to some more examples, but these 2 are two of the best documented examples of the travelers I can find, which is to say that by looking at the Dunhuang documents, I found a lot of long-distance travelers. There are 1 or 2 commercial travelers, but there are hundreds of diplomatic travelers. So this is a problem for some sort of the question that we had to face, right? And this is sort of one of the reasons why the book is called The King's Road, meaning that the kind of travelers that I observed were primarily sent out by these political leaders rather than for commercial reasons. The second aspect of the question about what was the Silk Road is its chronology. Again, we have a pretty well-established chronology for the Silk Road. And here I'm quoting Philip Curtin in Cross-Cultural Creating World History, that there are heights of Silk Road and there are lows. When the Silk Road is prospering, and there are times when the Silk Road was in decline. So most scholars believe that there are 3 heights. So the first height is the Han-Roman period. This is the original Silk Road, defined by Ishofen. And then you have the Tang Abbasid period. This is the second height of the history of the Silk Road. And then finally, you have the Mongol Empire, obviously another height of the Silk Road. And in between, you have, once these large empires fall and decline, the Silk Road also come into decline along with these empires. And the time period that I cover in the book, on the basis of the Dunhuang documents from 850 to 1000, falls into one of these times of decline. So this is supposedly when the Silk Road came into decline. If you read the work of another renowned scholar, Maurice Rosabi, who tells us that starting from 845, the court, as well as the rebels, talking about China, targeted and attacked Buddhism and other foreign religions. And most foreigners reacted by avoiding China, leading to 4 centuries of limited intercultural contact along the Silk Road. So this is one sort of specific example of this chronology, right? So essentially, many, if not most, scholars believe this chronology. And this is another thing that I think the Dunhuang documents help us put into question. Because if you look at examples from Dunhuang, the intercultural connection between China and Central Asia was fairly robust. And I'll give you a few examples. Here is a Khotanese document that tells us that the Khotanese, these 2 envoys, this person has a Tibetan name, this is a Khotanese name, they were on their 7th trip from Khotan to Dunhuang. So if you're on your 7th trip to some place, that probably means that the 2 places have a pretty well-established connection. Here's another example talking about, and this is, it's the text is written on the other side of the document. So the document is not in Chinese, obviously. It talks about this envoy who had served 5 times as envoys and entered the Chinese capital. So here again, another example that shows you the frequency of diplomatic travel. Here is another example in Uyghur, where a Turfan envoy writing in Uyghur says that I have been to the divine state of Yaglakar, which is Ganzhou, once, but I have been to the blessed state of Dunhuang 4 times from Turfan. Again, people talking about how frequent these journeys were. From the other direction, right? So we have direct testimonies from the travelers themselves. From the hosts who received them, we have a document that tells us that once the travelers came, they stayed for a very long time. The Dunhuang government were providing wine for envoys from Turfan for 91 days in 1964 consecutively, for 129 days for Khotanese envoys, and for 143 days for Ganzhou envoys. So people travel a lot. People stay for a long time. This is not a world where connections were limited. And corroborating evidence can also be found in transmitted Chinese sources. So I haven't talked about these very much, but I use them a lot in the book too. These are texts that are produced by the Chinese government, right? These aren't Dunhuang documents. But by sort of counting the numbers that references to envoys from the West in the Song Dynasty document, we can see that from the year and Tang and Song document and the 5 dynasties documents, we can see that from the year 850 to 1050, at least 40 missions from Dunhuang arrived at the Chinese court. Or 40 missions from Dunhuang to the Chinese court are recorded. And between 870 to 1030, the kingdom of Ganzhou, which is a neighbor of Dunhuang, sent no less than 79 diplomatic envoys, diplomatic missions to the Chinese court. And then at the same time, you also had this other superpower of the Liao Khitan Empire of the Liao in the north. And we know that the kingdom of Ganzhou sent, or at least there are 31 recorded missions to Liao. So these are pretty impressive numbers, but they're by no means complete, because the Dunhuang missions that I just talked to you about, that we know from Dunhuang document that they arrived in Chang'an, none of them were, the 2 that I talked about, neither of them were recorded in the Chinese sources. So you know that the numbers here, impressive as they may, are maybe only a fraction of what actually was going on. So this is a very busy world of travel. So this is another sort of revision that the Dunhuang documents allows me to make to the chronology of the history of the Silk Road. So maybe the Silk Road does not rise and fall along with the rise and fall of large empires. Maybe it has its own rhythm. So a third of the aspect, the reassessment of the role of the Silk Road is its social impact. It is very often said that the Silk Road is primarily a channel of precious goods that serve the needs of the elites at the end of the journey, right? So it has very limited impact on the people on the road. So is that the case? If we look at this again, right? This chart of the counter gift that the diplomatic travelers from Dunhuang to Chang'an they acquired. If we break it down, and the gifts were given to them according to different ranks. So the lowest rank of the envoys obviously got the least amount of return gift from the Tang Emperor. But even the lowest ranked person received about almost 50p, or almost 600 meters of soap, and a set of cotton clothing. What does this mean? 600 meters of silk. What does this mean in the local economy of Dunhuang? We have a lot of contracts. We have contracts that record economic transactions when people sell and buy things. So by looking at these contracts, we can assess the relative value of these numbers. So here I'm giving you some examples, right? So 48.84p of silk equals, and there are a few examples, I'm not going to talk about every one of them, but equals about 28 years of average farming income of a well-to-do family in Dunhuang. We have a few examples of people buying and selling houses. This amount of silk could buy about 26 small houses. It can hire a male labor to work for you for 55 years, and it can feed an adult male for 165 years. So it is an enormous amount of wealth that this person was able to acquire from this one trip. And I would argue that this is the reason why people were so keen on joining these journals. Here's another example, right? This is someone who borrowed stuff to fund his trip. So here you can see the kind of investment that they make. So this person in 941, Luo Xianxin borrowed 1p of raw silk before his journey as an envoy to the Chinese capital. And in this contract, it tells us that if the trip was successful, and if he was able to come back successfully, he would repay the debtor 2p of raw silk, which means that the rate of this contract is 100%. The interest is 100% on the goods borrowed. And again, do the same math. 1p of silk is able to buy you half of a small house, and you can spend, and that accounts for about half the income of an average farming family. So the investment that these travelers are making to fund their own journeys were also significant. To the extent that we can see the significance or the sort of prominence of these economic activities, I turn to the work of Chang Pei, who wrote this path-breaking book on the economic activities in Dunhuang on the basis of contracts. So he discovered a really intriguing phenomenon. So of the 47 contracts that he studied for this book, 19 of them, so 19, almost, maybe not half, but 40%, almost 40%, are about a very specific activity. 40% of these contracts are made when someone needs to travel as a diplomatic traveler, and to prepare for that journey, they need to borrow something. This is a very specific activity that, now in our world, right? Diplomats preparing a journey somewhere, and they need to prepare for their food and stuff. It's a very tiny fraction of our economy. But in Dunhuang, this is a central fact of the economy, to the point that about 40% of all the existing contracts that we have are dealing with this. So I would argue this is one example, and there are other examples to show that economic activities related to the Silk Road is central to the economy of Dunhuang. It's not just sort of a flyover country. To the point that people in Dunhuang organize themselves into these organizations, such as the Society for Long Distance Travel, to help fund their trip. And this is a sort of rule or stipulation, a document that records the stipulation of this society that tells you the kind of amount of money that you had to contribute when someone's leaving, the amount of money they had to contribute, or not money, but like wine and clothes. You had to contribute when someone's coming back. But important line, the most important line to me in this text is that the last one that I quote here: trips for private purposes do not fall within the perimeter of this stipulation, which means that this only covers official trips on the behalf of the Dunhuang government. So this, I would argue, is another example to show that these really are central to the economy and social life of Dunhuang. There are further questions that I want to kind of also address at the end of the talk. Of course, I'm dealing with a large collection document, but primarily one collection. So the bias that's inherent in this collection is important to consider. And the representativeness is particularly important. So I'm not trying to argue that because this is what I see in the Dunhuang document, this must have been true everywhere else at all times. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am trying to say is that the picture that you gain from the largest archive of pre-modern Eurasia is different enough from the picture that we often have of the Silk Road that maybe a lot of the questions that deserves a re-examination. So hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to have works that focus on other parts of the world, the Eurasian world, and other time periods that could help us build a more sort of evidence-based picture of the history of the Silk Road. But, and this is a big, or if rather, it's a big if, right? If the Silk Road can be demonstrated as primarily a diplomatic rather than a commercial network, then how does it change our understanding of global history? I would argue that it does. So the history of the globe, global connections is should probably not be considered as a ever-growing and intensifying network of trade. But at some point, there is a fundamental change in the nature of these networks, that we shouldn't use commerce and trade as the only important parameter to understand global history in the pre-modern period. And there are other things that I covered in this book. I'll just very quickly give you an overview. After the introduction, I talk about who the travelers are. In the first chapter, I kind of introduced the Dunhuang documents. Second chapter, I kind of gave you an overview of who the travelers were. Chapter 3, I talk about all the things that traveled with these travelers, non-human entities, right? And then I talk about how they navigated the road by using geographical texts, by writing poetry, by compiling a list about the road. I talk about how they navigated their relationship with the hosts, and I talk about how they exchange gifts with their hosts and people they meet on the road, and finally how they navigated the multilingual world of Eurasia. And then finally, the last part, I talk about the economic impact of this diplomatic network on places like Dunhuang. I also discuss the ideological impact of this network on how the kings saw themselves. This is something that I didn't really talk about today, but that's in chapter 9. And finally, I talk about how people viewed and discussed and prayed for the safety on the road in their daily life. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can pick up a copy of the book, and I would very much look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.